Thank you, Jacinto, for the presentation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all if you are watching on YouTube. I would like to say thank you for inviting me to be here today. Thank you for everyone at CECID, Cevipol, Americas, and you, Jacinto, for the invitation and your friendship and everything. I'll go right away to establish like the motivation of this presentation. Here is a very simple graph with the number of enrollments in Brazilian higher education. I'll be talking about this across my whole presentation, about a context, as you can see, of intense and fast expansion in higher education in the country. But before analyzing it, I will talk about inequality and I will talk about the educational system in itself. But before doing that, maybe we are here in a university setting and we take for granted why we should be talking about that. But university and higher education, and especially in Brazil, it's important and at an individual and societal level. In an individual level, it changes your life chances completely. It gives you access to better jobs, it gives you higher incomes, it gives you better health outcomes. And from a societal level, in the landscape of Brazilian science and innovation, it's important in development point of view, because it's in the higher education system that most of science in Brazil is built. So I think it's very important to understand how a developing country can have equitable and important higher education sector. I'll talk about that in a context of expansion, as you saw, but let me just remind you that the most of population in Brazil does not have access to higher education. So here, this graph shows this very briefly across generations. This is the proportion of populations aged between 26 and 30 across 4 years. So when the lines go up, we see that people have these people aged across this age bracket have less or more of each educational level. As the lines are moving up, we are seeing that over the years, the educational system developed and became more present for most of the population. But the last point there, it's the proportion of people aged 26 and 30 that at least started higher education. The situation got better, but it's 25% of the population only. Countries like Germany, Belgium, France, South Korea, it can be between 50 and 70%. So you can see how we still have a huge way to go. In the presentation today, I will talk, so I'll be focused in how people appropriate the opportunities created by education expansion, presenting to you two papers that one that I worked with, one that I'm working with, and the third line of research I'll presenting, I will focus only on the institutional side, the supply of higher education in the country, but because in comparative perspective, Brazil has a different pattern that I think it's very interesting and I want to show to you. So this first paper, let me give credit to my colleagues. I worked with Letícia Marteletto and Murilo Machner in this paper that it's called Education Stratification After a Decade of Reforms on Higher Education Access in Brazil, published in Research in Social Stratification and Mobility, volume 46. You can find it online and you can also write to me that I will happily send to you. So the problem that we tackle in this paper is illustrated in this graph. So this graph basically divides education expansion in how it is appropriated by two different social groups that I called here A and B. We can think A and B as social classes, as racial groups, as males and females, any way we want. my research is very focused on the material part of how people appropriate educational opportunities. So I basically define these groups as socioeconomic groups or classes. But here it illustrates in a very direct way that if you see that both lines have a positive slope, which means that both groups are entering higher education but the differences between the two groups don't grow, right? So inequality is a relative concept. And we can see here that even though in absolute terms, this educational system is becoming more present for the whole population and even for the unprivileged group in this situation would be B, but in relative terms, B is not in a better situation in comparison to A. So, and let's say the labor market demands more this educational level. Let's say it's high school. Group B would be in a disadvantage across time. So that's why it's important to keep in mind that inequality and inequality opportunity is a relative concept. And I will show you here. And so this is the basically reasoning of educational stratification research. This is a very common pattern. This is a hypothesis that I'll test here and show to you what happened in Brazil, especially with higher education. The countries that the literature shows that did not happen, that this didn't happen, meaning that the unprivileged group, the rate of entrance in the educational system and desired educational levels was more intense for the unprivileged group. The only exceptions to the pattern that I show were Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden, which were countries with huge redistribution policies across the 20th century and welfare states very well established. So here I'm testing for higher education what happened in Brazil. So that situation there is a situation of these privileged countries. And I wanted to test what happened in Brazil recently in this landscape of higher education growth. This is just a basic table showing you some variables that are important to consider in Brazilian higher education, which is divided in public and private sector, distance education, and present regular education. In three types of degrees, which are bachelor, vocational, and teaching licenses, and fields of study, which every country has. This landscape of change in opportunities happened with many social policies that were developed to try to foster widening participation of social groups in Brazilian higher education. Here I will focus on the demand side and later on the supply side. From the demand side, there were basically policies that tried to bring unprivileged groups defined by income and race to, in the private sector of Brazilian education. The private sector has historically, on average, 75% of enrollments of the educational system in the country. So the government tried to make this private sector more accessible to students through different means, mainly through loans and subsidies given to the educational providers and to the students themselves. And also there was an important law in the public federal sector of affirmative action, which gives quotas and reserves some slots for students of unprivileged groups from public school, which is a proxy for low income, and public schools, low income students, and also racial groups, students from unprivileged racial groups. So to study that, we we don't have a data that follows generations across their life courses in Brazil. So we need to make use of surveys that have retrospective data that people are aged, people are all over their ages, but they give retrospective measures about their situations when they were a certain age. And this is used as a variable by us to understand how people from different social backgrounds had opportunities to enter the higher education system. And this is what this data does. It's from ILO, International Labor Office, right, in Geneva. It's a school transition survey. It has from many developing countries. And crucially, we can compare two generations that had different opportunities to enter higher education in Brazil, and one that went through, especially the policies that I mentioned before, were in place, and the other generation, even though they are very close in age, they had very different opportunities. And we wanted to test basically if change happened by race and socioeconomic status. We do that with multivariate analysis that I'll be happy to discuss later, but they are totally appropriate for this data structure that we have. So here I'll start to show some results. Basically here, if these points in the horizontal axis, I have time, we have time, the two generations. If these points converge, inequality is going down. If they diverge, inequality is going up. If they stay the same, inequality is stable. Testing the probability, and each symbol here, there's a the symbol on the top it is people from privileged status, from families that had students that come from families that at least one parent had higher education themselves, the parent had higher education, and contrasting with people that comes from families this didn't happen. And as you can see, statistically, these symbols are stable. So across time, nothing happened with inequality. Inequality to enter higher education by socioeconomic status was stable across generations. It's a pattern of, it's not the title of this slide, it's a pattern of persistent inequality by socioeconomic status. But by race, interestingly, this is the first paper that showed that. You can see that the points converge. So racial stratification, this is the first sign that that putting race into the policies may have worked, and the younger generation, the probability of whites and non-whites, I like to call them, in Brazil we say negros, which is pardos and pretos together, black and brown, people that self-identify themselves as these categories. So we find a convergence of probabilities. These are predicted probabilities controlled by many other variables from a multivariate statistical model. So it's a sign that the race converged across the country. So in these results, we confirm it. We put Brazil and update Brazilian results in the pattern of persistent inequalities in terms of socioeconomic status in access to higher education. But we know that in absolute terms, more poor students are entering higher education. So we can analyze the situation as a glass half empty or half full. Inequality is stable, but we see more people inside the system, right? And we have this positive result, optimistic result by race, that racial stratification diminished in the higher education system. Some policies implications are that we thinking about the result for socioeconomic status, we can argue, we can ask, like, how could policies diminish the informational and financial constraints of students that could foster higher education expectations among disadvantaged students, or even deepen the policies that will make incentives higher and costs lower for them to enter higher education. And for race, I think we really needed to go through the mechanisms that may have changed to see what happened to drive these results. So this is what is the first results that I wanted to show you. Now let's move on to the second paper. This paper I conduct with Adriano Sienkiewicz, which he's a Brazilian civil servant in the Ministry of Education, and Carlos Antônio Costa Ribeiro, which is a colleague in ESP, where I studied. In this paper, we ask similar questions, but we have better data. And if you compare this illustration here with the one that I presented previously, you can see that instead of only the black lines, there is also the blue lines here. So by adding these blue lines, we wanted to combine socioeconomic status with other variables, in this case, race, to see within racial groups, for instance, if we take rich students and separate them between white students and black students, what are their outcomes if the outcomes of black students are as high as white students, for instance, within an income strata. So that's why we are adding here the blue lines, and this is a way the literature now treats this, like it calls attention to matters of intersectionality, right? So we are approaching the intersectionality of race and income in the structuring of higher educational opportunity in Brazil. So in a dialogue with these new results, with my previous results, we are adding race like this, but we also are adding performance, educational performance, which for obvious reasons is an important dimension to study inequality in any context, because your background can affect your educational decisions directly and also indirectly through your performance in the educational system, which is also structured by your socioeconomic or any other dimension of backgrounds. So explicitly, our research questions here are: what is the probability of entering higher education structure among students from different income strata? To what extent do white and non-white students have different opportunities? How do income and race combine in structuring educational opportunities and competing for a place in higher education? And does income erase racial stratification? This is a hypothesis that comes from the common sense in Brazilian discussions, that as you move up the social structure, your racial background wouldn't matter. Sociological work in Brazil shows that this does not happen, but newspaper discussions and policy discussions continue to be framed around this, and we wanted to test to give evidence if this happens or not with new data. Our data is special because we have access to a selective system, which is called ENEM. Any student that wants a place in higher education in Brazil takes this test. It's like the SAT in the US, the Abitur in Germany. I don't know if in Belgium there's something like that, but students there that want to enter higher education, public higher education, or if they want to participate in social policies for subsidies and financing their studies, they Enem's compulsory. So basically working with Adriano, this is confidential data, but Adriano Sienkiewicz is a civil servant. He went through the process of accessing the data so we can track one generation of students in Brazil that took this exam and follow them and where did they go to higher education from other data which is high quality register or administrative data from the Ministry of Education. It's the higher education system. Higher education census. So basically we have excellent data to answer our research questions. So we once again are discussing only if the person entered or not higher education is our dependent variable. We have 8 income strata, per capita income strata from the students' families divided by one quarter of the minimum salary in brackets. So we have 8 brackets. We have the self-identified racial category of the students, and we have educational performance, which is a test that the students take. And we also have controls like age, school, sector, and other variables that are important in a multivariate analysis. We model with, we use models adequate for binary variables, and also we try to illustrate that in a very intuitive fashion, and we also decompose the effects between the direct and indirect effects, which means direct effects go straight from income to probability of entrance, and we also decompose how much of the total probability goes through the performance of the students. I will show you. I think it's very intuitive. So here first I'm showing some descriptive statistics that show you that the performance of students is structured by income, and that Black students are different from white students. Why? If you read this graph horizontally, the boxes are moving up. So this means that in each division is one income bracket. So clearly, as you move up the income brackets, performance goes up. The red boxes are for the whole sample. The blue boxes are for white students and gray boxes for Black students. If you analyze each income strata, which is a division here, unfortunately I forgot to label correctly the graph, but each box is one of the income strata we are using. In every income strata, gray boxes have lower performance than blue boxes. So this means that students in the same, Black students in the same income strata than white students have lower educational performance. Here is the proportion of students in the 8 income strata, the proportion of students that enter higher education. Please be aware that the graph starts at 40%, okay? So once again, from left to right, when you read the graph horizontally, you can see that as your income goes up, your probability of entering higher education goes up as well. And once again, within income strata, we see that gray bars are lower than blue bars, which means that with the same income of white students, Black students have lower probabilities of entering higher education. And finally, here there's a change in the illustration. Now, the symbols are the income strata, and horizontally we have 10 strata of educational performance. So here, let's focus on my left here, the red symbols, okay? As you go up educational performance, your probability of entering higher education goes up. But if you compare the symbols, the squares are high-income students. These symbols are lozengos, maybe, right? Yeah, diamonds, great. Diamonds are the lowest income bracket. You can see here that educational performance practically doesn't matter for rich students, and it matters a lot for poor students, okay? So this was very surprising for us. So basically we are showing descriptive results that rich students don't depend on their educational performance to enter higher education, okay? And poor students do. And on the other graph, once again, blue and gray symbols, we once again divide between blacks and whites, and you can see that in the same performance strata, the blacks have less probability of entering higher education, even though they have the same income of whites. So we have descriptively seen that there is racial stratification in these results, which we test in the next results. So this is a result of a decomposition. These are probabilities from a multivariate statistical model, but here what I want to focus is on the following. Here we are comparing, I'm not showing in this graph the poorest students. So here is the difference in probability between all students in all other income brackets and poor students, okay? So let's not differentiate colors for a second. So as we move up, it's quite intuitive, right? As you get richer, the difference between you and poor students entering higher education gets high or even huge. It's more than 50% for the richest students. But we wanted but now let's focus on the colors. The blue part is how much of this total difference goes through educational performance and how much it is a direct effect of income itself on the probability. You can see that the blue part is very stable. So we are basically in a more rigorous way testing the descriptive results and saying with stronger evidence that the inequality of opportunity in Brazil is not a matter of how students perform on a test, but is a matter of how can take advantage of their family backgrounds in the probability of accessing higher education. Racial stratification is a completely different result. Now we can test within the same income bracket between black and white students, and the direct effect of race is always positive. So this is a very established result in the literature that for the United States, for Sweden, England, these are the cases I know. Immigrant students or students from certain ethnic groups have higher education expectations than majorities, but worse socioeconomic situations. And this shows off in results like this, and we are now finding the same in Brazil, that the direct effect of race is positive. So racial stratification is more driven by performance than the direct effect of race. So within the same income brackets, there are differences, like black students are in a disadvantage than whites. This is the main result of this graph, and this whole difference can be accounted by how they perform on the tests, okay? Which leads us to think that if we want to understand racial stratification in the Brazilian educational system, we need to look to the classrooms and to the structuration of inequality in the educational system. Which is a policy interest in itself, right? How can we imagine the dynamic of classrooms in the of educational system that creates such different opportunities across? They are basically socioeconomically very similar, because our tests are quite rigorous, and we this is the first time that I see these results this is a whole research program that needs to be conducted, right? And we can also think about race and the cumulative effects of race and a whole life course that goes through disadvantage, and how this ends up in a moment that captures all this, which is a standardized test that you are fighting for opportunities. It like kinds of reifies your whole disadvantage across your life course. And from a policy point of view, the other types of results we can also think of is that, for instance, the debates that I was mentioning before, does income erase the racial effects? Obviously, it doesn't. And if we think about policies that try to widen participation in higher education, we can see that students do take advantage of their backgrounds. So how the privileged students, right? How can we think about policies that deepen opportunities for poor students? The policies that I mentioned before in the beginning of my presentation were discontinued in the last 4 years, or are being changed. So we were in kind of this positive policy environment to widen participation. This last government made many actions to disconstruct it. And here we have a context that points that we really need policies to foster unprivileged students to enter higher education, because inequalities are very high. And finally, in the last student, I turn my attention within higher education in itself, with two colleagues, with one colleague and one student, one PhD student, Marcelo Medeiros and Clarissa Tagliari, in this paper that's being revised in an international journal, and the title is Higher Education Expansion and Diversification, Privatization, Distance Learning, and Market Concentration in Brazil. The motivation of this paper, basically, I think that my presentation up to now had a very simple reasoning going from education expansion to inequality of opportunity, and basically we are arguing that to understand inequality of opportunity, we need to take a step back and analyze how the system is structured. And Brazil is an interesting case because the literature that focuses on higher education expansion is mainly European and American. And they think about higher education as an ecosystem with metaphors that come from biology. And they are very focused on heterogeneity. So basically here we can think about the symbols here as species in an environment, and let's say you change shapes is a different species, and you change colors is also a different species. We can deal with, there are many statistical indexes that we could measure the diversity of or heterogeneity of a system like that. As you can see, there's no change in shape of the symbols. And this is what we are talking about. We are talking about that to understand a Brazilian higher education, we need to look at not only heterogeneity, but also concentration, meaning that even if we follow the biological metaphor, we need to think about how these different species absorb resources in the environment, okay? So, of course, here we are thinking in terms of higher education institutions. We are basically saying a very intuitive thing, which is size matters. And I will show you how. We are basically saying, giving up on the biological metaphors and bringing political economy in and saying that monopolies and state regulation and other types of market and state behaviors are important to understand the educational supply.
Each item there is what? It's a university?
Each item would, in both illustrations, would be one, yeah. Like UBL would be here, and the other universities in Belgium as a whole would be here. But I think the literature has kind of a it's a failure of the literature because it seems that other educational systems are much more homogeneous in comparison to Brazil in terms of size. I think in a minute you will understand why this matters. And once again, we go back to the policy environment, and I will highlight mainly two changes in policy that are very important in the supply of higher education in Brazil. The first is that in 1996, the whole legislation around education changed, and in 1997, there was a huge deregulation of higher education provision, mostly authorizing institutions to become companies, for-profit companies, and, for instance, to to be traded in the stock exchange, for instance. And this had huge results that I'll show to you. And one thing that combined with that later was the deregulation and authorization of distance higher education that started in 2005. So distance regulation, due to the pandemic, we are dealing with that, but the higher education sector started to invest a lot in distance education in 2005, and you will see that this changed the higher education system in Brazil completely. Our research questions here are: how did Brazilian higher education expand? How do different institutions take advantage of the expansion? Was higher education expansion concentrated in a few institutions? Does a specific segment of the higher education system drive concentration? For that, we basically analyze all higher education institutions and enrollments in the system from 2002 to 2016, and our basic variables are two: sector, public versus private, mode of delivery, distance or regular or presence, and their combination. And our methods are descriptive statistics to study resource concentration, growth incidence curves and accumulated growth curves, and concentration indexes. So basically we take all the statistics used to study income concentration, and we just, instead of analyzing income, our main variable is enrollment. So we are analyzing the distribution of enrollments across higher education institutions of different sizes, and the index synthesizes these numbers in a convenient way. Here, you will excuse me, I will read a little bit to make the table more interesting. So here we have the distribution of enrollments by institution size as share of the total enrollment. So we take in each year the distribution of enrollment and divided it in 100 parts. So this table presents the distribution of enrollments by institution size as a share of total enrollment in each year. It shows that the system was already very concentrated at the beginning of the period in 2002. The top 1% concentrated slightly less enrollments than 16% than the sum of enrollments in the bottom 80% of smallest institutions. In 2007, the situation was exacerbated with the share of enrollment in the top 1% being already higher than that in the bottom 80%. The concentration kept increasing over the entire period except for 2002, possibly due to some data contingencies. This is another way of dealing with concentration. So this graph divides enrollment in 100 different parts in 2006, 2002, and 2016, and order it by institutions from smaller to bigger sizes. We then subtract enrollments of each of the 100 sections and calculate if each small fraction grew or not across the time span that we are analyzing. We see here in this graph that growth occurred along the entire distribution, but was much larger in the biggest institutions, which is way over the average. The shape of the incidence curve shows that increasing rates of growth from the smallest institutions up to the 75% region, which is here. Then rates diminish substantially from that point to 90%, and then the biggest institutions concentrated had much higher growth rates, and this divides the it's the growth concentration by size of institution that takes only growth into account and see how each segment of institution side appropriated the most of the whole growth of the system. So this table provides yearly information about the share of total growth accumulated by different classes of institutions, ordered by size. The table shows the contribution of the growth of each class of institutions in each year to the total growth over the entire period. The total growth of the Brazilian higher educational system was very concentrated. It was predominantly driven by a few institutions, the large ones. In fact, the top 1% of institutions was responsible for more than 1/3 of all growth in the period. Alone, this small group contributed to more than twice the increase compared to the bottom 80% of institutions. In absolute terms, the increase in enrollment in the top 1% was higher than the entire increase of the bottom 90% of institutions. Of the total expansion in enrollments, 60% occurred at the top 5% of institutions. And here, I'm reaching the limit of my presentation. Here, we basically take these numbers and construct an index that can synthesize them, which is called the Thiel index. And this Thiel index has a property that it can be decomposed by the combination of these variables that I presented previously, basically sector and mode of delivery. And here are the results by year, so we can answer what type of profile of institution drove concentration. And so this table shows that the drivers of the increase in inequality or concentration, the table shows this. The table shows that market concentration in Brazilian higher education increased mostly due to a combination of privatization and virtualization. Specifically, private distance education was the main driver of concentration. In 2002, the private sector contributed to 60% of all concentration. 14 years later, it was responsible for 77% of concentration, a substantial increase for a market that was already very concentrated at the beginning of the period. The whole of private distance education inequality went from 0 to 40%, surpassing the contribution of any other source of inequality in 2016. So here this combination of distance education, private higher education, and for-profit higher education is not very common. We didn't find similar cases in the literature, and we are seeing here that the huge consequences of deregulation in this educational sector in the country. To give you a context, basically what happened with this deregulation is that these huge economic groups started to buy and consolidate. A huge movement of market consolidation happened. Small and local family institutions were bought and are being bought by basically 5 economic groups that have their shares sold in the stock exchange and etc. In terms of the educational environment, I think it's very important to deal with that, because these groups first, they don't invest at all in research. Second, they focus a lot on a small set of fields of study. Third, labor relations are not very, they try as much as possible to make classrooms big. They are using artificial intelligence to make and correct exams, these types of stuff. We can think about the quality of the education that's being provided in that scenario, right? And some paradoxes as well emerge. So how to increase supply and foster heterogeneity. So in a country with the level of development and income of Brazil, we can't not trust in the private system to foster participation. So there's a big paradox here. How can we develop regulation policies that maybe can give incentives to the sector to become more heterogeneous, do some research, and have better labor relations, for instance? And also, how do we expand the system, trusting private higher education without making the burden for families and students, for instance, the financial burden of loans and etc. We need to be creative and think about solutions that will make use of this part of the higher education system, but not getting the outcomes as we are observing in other countries with these huge debts and inequality happening. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you have a good Q&A. Here is my contact. Here is my Twitter. And thank you very much for being here.
Okay. Thank you, Flavio. Thank you, Flavio, very much for your presentation. We have time for questions. So what I'm going to ask is that if there's people in the room who want to ask a question, that you please use the microphone, because this is being recorded. If there are people on Teams who want to ask questions, please feel free, go ahead. You can just unmute yourself and ask the question immediately. So first, anyone in the room who has a question? No? Okay. Let's see if there's questions on Teams. Just a second. Okay. Well, I have a couple of questions. Maybe I'm gonna ask mine first.
Yeah.
And then
People, it takes a minute,
we'll
right?
keep track. And also, Flavio said that if you have questions afterwards, you can also email him if you want. So I will start.
I'll write down here. I'm not sending emails or checking my WhatsApp, okay?
Good. No, this is not working. Okay. Here we go. So thank you for your very rich presentation. I have two questions. One is, why do you think that the Workers' Party policies that enabled a reduction in the inequality, racial inequality, so they clearly had a positive effect in terms of letting people from disadvantaged backgrounds to go to university, study in university. Why did they not work so well when it comes to income inequality? So that would be my first question. And then my other question is, if you can connect a little bit the results that you presented for your first papers with the final one. So what you showed, one of the things you showed at the beginning is that if you're rich, then it really doesn't matter whether you're a good student or not, you will always go to university. But do you still go to the same university? Because in the final part of your presentation, you showed us that the field has been changing and that you have this like distance, like remote teaching institutions that are private, that are for profit, that are not necessarily the best quality institution you can get. But is that where the wealthy kids end up? And if so, does it in a way compensate because they're not getting as good an education as they would otherwise? Or is there also, does that market still reflect the inequalities that they have from the beginning, right? So those are my two questions.
Okay, I'll answer them so people are encouraged to make more. Let me just go back in some contextual information here. So my whole presentation happened, as the title of the presentation says, in the Works Party government, which had many policies that tried to both make higher education grow and widen participation of unprivileged groups defined by either income or race in higher education. This growth, I didn't highlight this result, it almost coincides with the end of the government of the Workers' Party. So my whole presentation is basically covering a period of the Workers' Party in the government. I'll start by your second question. In terms of this line of research, your question falls, you are completely, I think your intuition is going in a great direction. Basically, my presentation was about vertical stratification, which vertical, basically you contrast higher education and secondary education. But your question goes in the direction of horizontal stratification, which is once you start analyzing an educational segment, you need to look within it as well, like the end of my presentation showed. Connecting both results, so this is a direction I'm going in my future research. So basically connecting the heterogeneity of the system and how race and income backgrounds affect where you end up, right? Which is basically what you were saying. Connecting both paper results, I would say that and I actually have results from other papers that show that the incorporation of students from unprivileged backgrounds was mainly in you can say mainly sectors of innovation, in a sense, which means new fields of study, new modes of delivery. So they are incorporated, but the status quo doesn't change a lot. So the unprivileged groups, they are basically entering more in distance education in two fields of study, which are teaching and business administration, which are huge in Brazil. These two fields of study basically have 35% of the total enrollments. We can also look at the other side of the socioeconomic spectrum, right? Like where do the rich students go? That I think you are also interested. Because as we were mentioning, mainly don't go to selective higher education institutions because many don't have the performance, right, to go to academic selective institutions. So, but they for sure do not share the same institutions of students of other socioeconomic groups. So there's this intermediary sector that still caters to privileged students. So there is like, what's new, this always happens. So what's new is another type of sector that caters also to poor students and students that are accessing more, mainly in this period that we analyze due to subsidies and financing, like loans. So this is what I would have. I would answer you. Unfortunately, we don't have much data that allows me to reply what happens to these students in the future and their futures. I don't know how their socioeconomic results, labor market prospects and outcomes, if they differ or not. And this is another, there are many research questions that if I delve here, it would be, I can only speculate because you don't have data to study it. But what I can say is that it varies a lot. And what we see, I can give you an example of research I read about medicine, it depends on the field of study. In sectors like medicine, it doesn't matter. You can go to, you can have low performance and pay for your schooling and get very good outcomes later. So it depends. I don't have information about other fields of study. This is I'm trying to push some students and colleagues to research that because naturally it's very important. Your first question was related to why race, why the policies related to race seem to work and the policies related to socioeconomic status didn't seem to work, right? And what I think happened, I would answer you with unintended effects of race, of affirmative action, mainly through a restructuration of education expectations. So I wouldn't say it's only policy, but I think that what happened since the 2000s in the racial debates in Brazil were against the game changed completely in terms of identity politics and identity culture in general. And a big part of that was affirmative action and the racial aspect of affirmative action. So for many students, race and education expectations go together. It's part of racial politics, of affirming that elites need to be diversified, that they need to be actors in the game of changing and coloring elites in Brazil and etc. And I think that this was a huge motivation to changing expectations and etc. That I would go mainly in that direction. So I wouldn't say that it's more that is like it's more an unintended effect than a direct effect of the policies in themselves, mainly because the policies. The more intense politics affect a small sector of the Brazilian higher education environment, which are the public schools, right? Which are only 25%. So if we focus only on the public higher education, we wouldn't. It wouldn't have so much of an effect. I think there's a question here.
Actually, I have a question about that. It's about private institutions and affirmative actions. So did private higher education institutions had to use affirmative actions and to select their students? And then there are two more questions, so maybe I tell you the other questions later on the chat.
You can go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are two questions. The first one, it's Frédéric. He tells that your presentation is very interesting first.
Thank you.
He cannot open his microphone, so I will tell the question. Could you speak a little about the evolutions of the higher education policies and tendencies under Bolsonaro administration? So current tendencies. And then there is Celi, which is asking, at a moment, it was mentioned that Germany, the Netherlands and Sweden are permitting more inclusion. What can we learn from those systems? So, and then, sorry, I have another question. I know that you're not working about that now, and you are working more about the changes with the PT, but maybe you can give me your opinion. How do private institutions take advantage of the COVID crisis? And then do you think that it can increase even more inequalities?
Okay. Just 1 minute so I can write it down. Okay, so the first question was private institutions and affirmative actions. The main incentive across the loans. No, let me rephrase. Sorry. So to participate in the loan system and the subsidy system that students had, to receive students that participated in the loan system, in the subsidy system, the institutions, the private higher institutions needed to basically do something in the federal bureaucracy, which was not compulsory. Of course, this was a huge interest. It was in their interest because they would receive tuition money, okay? So this is another characteristic, let me highlight. When I say public institutions, it means tuition free, okay, in Brazil. And private always have tuition. So a private institution wants tuitions, right? But not all. So we can differentiate within the private sector these like boutique, you know, institutions which cater to economic elites that didn't take part of these policies. So they didn't want students that had loans or subsidies, but the majority of the institutions that wanted to receive these systems, the system had the affirmative policies in themselves. So there were some kinds of socioeconomic and racial quotas in the subsidies and loans. So I would differentiate. So some private institutions indirectly, for students receiving loans or subsidies, indirectly conducted affirmative action, but these were not actions of themselves. You know, this was like, it was an incentive of the government to widen participation, and the elite institutions don't have any type of affirmative action. What I see, it's an ideological stance that they don't agree that race matter in inequality in Brazil. The evolution of policies under Bolsonaro, the loan policies were completely stopped after 2016 because there was a lot of defaults and people weren't paying their loans, and they are trying to reconstruct it, but this ended and the subsidies continue, but the subsidies were focused on students only students that came from public schools could access them. And last November, they changed that, and this will probably affect the policies and the affirmative action laws that were passed in 2012. This year, they are being there's a revision in them, so it will be a big legislative debate if they continue or not in the conditions that we are seeing currently. What can we learn from other countries like the ones I mentioned here that expanded their higher education systems? That's a great question. I think we can, from the many things I could highlight, one thing that I think it's very interesting, it's that term that I used is heterogeneity, you know? I really think these systems are interesting in terms of composition of field of study and also fields of study, and also these different types of institutions that some are more academic, others are more vocational, and etc. I think that these systems that have a very strong focus on developing skills and marketable skills. I think this is very interesting, and it's a way to give incentives of students to think that higher education can have an effect on their life chances and an incentive for them to have better careers and labor market prospects. And finally, how do private institutions took advantage of the COVID crisis? The COVID crisis hit private institutions very hard because they need tuition from students to operate, and students were giving up their studies in very high rates, therefore not paying tuitions. And from what I know, the government didn't take any initiative to, I don't know, to counteract this downward trend in enrollments in private institutions. So I think that that actually they were very negatively affected, and there weren't many policies in place to help them. I know that they lobbied a lot to try to build some kind of help from the government. Maybe this year or the next will be something from. But from what I know, no, they were hit, and they were fighting with their own resources to deal with the pandemic.
Thank you.
Wait, I'm just trying to turn on the mic. Yes, we have one more question. Well,
Oops.
go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, very interesting. And one thing that caught my attention is that why the non-white people with the same income, they have low performance or probability to go to universities. And what will be the reasons for that?
Let's take another, yeah.
Thank you, Flavio, for this wonderful presentation. I have just two quick questions. The first one, based on the first and second parts of the presentation, the two first papers. I guess you already responded part of the question, but I'll ask it anyways. If you have data disaggregated based on public and private universities for the roles of performance, race, and income on the impacts on certification. So if you see differences on in those roles, and their impacts on certification. And the second question is specifically about your the middle part of your presentation. And you mentioned about performance specifically being a very important variable to lower socioeconomic disparities among non-white students. So I wonder if you could expand a bit on the policy recommendations you would suggest specifically to improve performance or to reconceptualize what performance should mean in the assessment of higher education, and also specifically inside the classroom, how do you envisage that policy can affect or can be an important variable to remake performance, like to actually address, to actually increase performance for the diversity of students in the classroom. Thank you very much.
So thank you for your questions. The first question, it's basically a topic of interest in sociology, or in Brazilian sociology for a long time. And so I'll just rephrase to help me think, okay? So it's basically why people, they are very similar and differ only in terms of race, have such different results and opportunities, right? Well, I will give you the two mainstream answers. One is cumulative disadvantage. So meaning that the life courses of these people are not as similar as they seem in terms of social networks, the quality of the schools they go, and other types of environments, because race it's a generational and cumulative process. So this is a part of the answer. The other answer usually is discrimination, but discrimination in this type of selection, it's very difficult to envision, because it's an anonymous test. You know, there's no actor to enact discrimination, at least, please, in general, in other types of situations and inequality, let's say to get a job, interviews, any type of interaction, discrimination is always a candidate operating in the structuring of racial inequality. But in this context, since we are analyzing data from an anonymous standardized test, discrimination I think is not such a good hypothesis. I would point to cumulative disadvantage, or we can make a higher a type of interpretation that connects both, like I tried to make here, that in the sense that if we think why the performance of people that are so similar is so different, and since we are pointing that performance is very important, why are the performances of these two racial groups structured so differentially? And there's a lot of qualitative result and a bit of quantitative results that draws our attention towards classroom dynamics and some types of teacher treatments and etc. I will connect this to answer you thinking about policies. I will bring another, if we think that testing can be, these types of tests can also be thought as they are policy in themselves, right? It's a centralized system to select students. And we know that these standardized exams can have some types of constructs that are racialized. We have seen that in other countries. That, for instance, in the USA, there's strong evidence that the SAT, for instance, given different vernacular traditions, you know how people from different races, for instance, use the English language, how they perform in the SAT, and that this is racialized in some sections of the test in favor of Black students and other sections to their disadvantage. And this would be a good hypothesis in Brazil as well, in my opinion. For instance, there's a foreign language component in this test that we use. So if for composition matters, the Black population is located in schools which are served with worst foreign language teachers, I can see ways that this would affect their performance on this test. So the components of this test can be a part of the answer. But I will also I don't know if I know how to answer how to fight discrimination within classrooms, you know, besides like teacher training and sensibilizing teachers of hidden bias, this kind of stuff that can happen kind of by accident, and try to make them more conscious of their own bias and what can be happening, because it's in such a micro level, right? That but I don't know. Maybe if you don't like my answer, you can like part of my answer that teachers in any type of, that teachers need to be, teachers are part of the answer. I don't know how. I give an example. And the other questions is the disaggregated data, and if I could tell you a little bit of if we could basically. I think the question is if we could have other types of outcomes and not only access or not higher education, right? And we are going in that direction. And one thing that we are seeing is that we knew that intuitively already, but we are basically measuring it, which is that the public school is completely competitive. So you only enter academically competitive, right? You enter you enter the public system making very strict selections, and you need basically all institutions have numerus clausus, right? So it's not an open door, and you need to have a certain level of achievement to go into them. And the private schools, it's basically the opposite. Like if you have the pocket, you can enter. So this is a part of the answer. I would also highlight how this is complete. This totally depends on field of study as well. There are few fields of study that are very academically selected and socioeconomically selected, like maybe 5, which are law, international relations, medicine, some in others and other health fields and engineering, and basically the other fields of study are quite open to different profiles of studies. So to understand, I think that it's very important, besides the modes of delivery and sector, bring fields of study. I have these results that I mentioned here. I have worked on them, not taking performance into account, but I'm working in that direction, and soon I will deal with it as well.